Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends.
Welcome to Life Support, where we talk about story and hope and healing. I'm Steve Johnson from Five Stone Media, not your regular host, Pastor Paul, because Pastor Paul is sitting across the table from me today in the guest chair. We're reversing the chairs, and our host has become the guest. And full disclosure, Paul and I are brothers, but we want Paul to talk about his story today. And he has been a survivor of some tragedies, and we'll break all of that down. But first of all, just kind of a summary, he lost his first wife to cancer and was left to raise 3 kids alone. And then in 2013, he lost a son to homicide, and we'll talk about those experiences today. So, Paul, how does it feel being in that chair?
Well, I thought it was a good idea when we planned to do this. Now I'm rethinking it. It's strange to be over here.
It's different because now it's kind of a hot seat. But I want to start diving in. Let's talk about the loss of a spouse, because we do talk about trauma on this program. So what were the circumstances surrounding the loss of your wife?
Well, Jody was 38 years old. She was healthy, had really never had any issues that required hospitalization or anything like that. We had 3 children that were anywhere from elementary age to young teenagers. And she began to just experience pain in her chest, and then they found a lump, and as it so often goes, they found breast cancer. And from the very beginning, we knew that it was a serious form. We knew that it was going to be aggressive, and the doctors were quite hopeful, though, because she had no other underlying health issues, and she was ready to fight it. So we had a good outlook on it, and she actually was quite a witness to our church that I was pastoring at the time in those early months, and she was very brave. But it's a chronic disease, and at the end of the day, it kept coming back and finally claimed her life.
You write about that in this devotional, God is Always With You, 31 Days of Hope and Healing for Grief and Loss. And one of the things you talk about there was how your congregation responded to all of that. And some of it very well-meaning, but some of it was kind of head-scratching at times. But you were on the pastoral staff of a large congregation at the time. So let's talk about their response to that with having one of their leaders going through this.
It was very hard for everybody. It was very uncomfortable because Jody became sort of this public figure within the church, if you want to use that terminology. She was used as sermon illustrations. They would bring her up front and get updates, but all the while everyone has an idea of how you should treat this. And we were living in Tucson, Arizona at the time. There's a very, very well-known cancer institute in Tucson, so we were comfortable with our doctors, we were comfortable with our situation, but the congregation had all kinds of crazy remedies, and I would come in my office and find, medicine ideas sitting on my chair. People wanted us to fly to Germany, to try these trials and all those kind of things. And then they would say things, that were kind of out of context, but they didn't know what to say. And so you kind of learned to just nod a lot and smile. But it became isolating because I didn't want to be in large groups anymore. I didn't really enjoy the Sunday morning experience because I knew I was going to be asked about it. And so I often counsel families that are going through that just to, sit down with whoever it is that's sick, come up with basically a company line. This is how we're going to answer these questions. Stick to the story, because you just don't have the wherewithal to explain the whole situation to everybody. But again, they meant well. But we've talked so much on this program about the best thing to do sometimes is to just not say anything. The best people that knew exactly what to do would walk by and just touch your arm, give you a little hug on the shoulder, and maybe send you a card, not ask anything of you, but that was a message saying we're with you 100%. So it was, 2,000 people in that church. It felt like we had to live the whole thing out in a fishbowl. And I think it was especially hard on the kids because I think they felt very pressed in. Everybody was worried about them, of course, but I don't know if they knew how to address them very well either.
Talking with Pastor Paul, who's the regular host of this program, LifeSupport. I'm Steve Johnson from Five Stone Media in the interviewer role today, but we're talking about some of Paul's life experiences, which really makes him equipped to be a great host for this program because you're very empathetic to the people that you interview on this program. What about the staff of your church? How did they respond? How was that? Did they stand off a little bit, not knowing what to say, or talk about that experience?
I think there were some of them that were wise enough to just minister to us without trying to steer us too much. At that point, I had not yet become a senior pastor, and our lead pastor frankly just didn't handle it very well. He was very demanding as far as how we should act, what we should say. I think he saw it as, representing the church. He kind of thrust me in this role of, you need to be representing the church and Christ in a particular way, which I didn't really need to hear at that point because I was just trying to get my family through this. And, I had to tell my kids twice that their mother was dying. The first time we thought that she was going to be okay, and I went home and told them she was fine. Then I had to tell them that she was sick again. Then I had to tell them that she was going to die. So his advice didn't really sink in very well. But I say, as a whole, the human condition is when you run into suffering, you don't want to take a step you shouldn't, and so your natural tendency is to not say anything or do anything, and then you kind of run the risk of sending a message to the person that you're on your own on this one. And so I think it varied, but it was a large staff. We had 35 administrative people, a number of different pastors, and I would say that we felt the staff became a pretty safe place, and I think that's really healthy at times like this. You can kind of go and go into the bunker almost, which sounds bad, but that's kind of how you feel.
Yeah. And you were young yourself at the time. You were 40-ish.
Yeah.
Going through all of that with 3 kids. Talk about the relationship with your children through all of that. And I know at one point, as you just said, you had to go home and tell them. Mm-hmm. And how was it being a caregiver to a spouse, raising 3 kids who were, I guess, teenagers or almost teenagers at the time, and having to be a church leader? I mean, that's just got to be a load that is almost unbearable. It
was difficult, but here's what happens when you're thrust into a long-term situation like that. It becomes a new normal, and I think those of you that have been through this understand what I'm saying. You kind of kick it into a gear where all of this abnormality becomes your life. And so, I learned how to get up in the middle of the night and cut pills. I learned how to get the kids off to school in the morning. I learned how to be involved with their schools. I learned how to juggle my emotions and be able to park them when I was working at the church and those kinds of things. But I think the thing that was most difficult was watching my kids grapple with it. They all 3 of them handled it completely different. They still today handle it completely differently. They, some have adjusted well, some of them have never adjusted. And you have to kind of watch that happen, knowing that God is with them. But each time I found out bad news about Jody, I happened to be with a friend of mine from my community group in Tucson, as God would have it, and he'll figure into the Taylor story as well. But each time the doctor called me with terrible news, I was, for some reason, with this guy named Gary. And so Gary could give me a little counsel, but then I had to drive home, and you're driving home and you're thinking, okay, what am I gonna say? How am I going to tell the kids? And I just went with basic, honesty. This is what it is. I don't think there was anything I could do to kind of beat around the bush. And actually, when Taylor died later, that was actually good training for me, because I had to do the same thing again to a different set of children. So it's weird.
And we'll talk more about that next week, about Taylor's death. But right now, Paul Johnson is our guest, who's normally the host, and we're talking about some of the losses that he's experienced in life and walking through that as a pastor and a church leader. The loss of his wife, Jody, which was just about 20 years ago. I think we're just about at
already
that 20-year anniversary.
Yep.
And I'm Steve Johnson, and I'm Paul's brother. And I just kind of remember, even though we weren't living in the same state, kind of seeing you go through that. And, God did not forget you, And what was really interesting for me was I was in a profession where I travel a lot, and it just so happened that during that time of Jody's sickness, which was a 2-year period, I ended up with a lot of business trips to Tucson, which I had never had. And ironically, we'll talk about your remarriage too. I haven't been back there since on a business trip, but during that time, God just brought me there a lot. And,
Right.
So God does not forget you through all that. But I just remember, I know you were hanging on by a thread.
Yeah, it certainly felt like that. And one of the side notes that, if speaking of what God does through these situations, is, I had come from being a broadcaster to being a pastor. So I was still doing broadcasting work for the University of Arizona at the time. And so I would travel with these different athletes and coaches and so forth. And so they watched Jody and I walk through this. And they saw the pain, but they also, I think, saw Jesus in that walk, because, Jody and I never wavered on the fact that God is doing something in this. So when it came time for the funeral, I was stunned at, hundreds and hundreds of people from the University of Arizona Athletic Department came to the funeral. They heard the gospel clear as can be. Yeah. And that was all part of the process as well. And, I remember getting up in the mornings and I would say, Lord, help me just to live my faith out today. But it had to be His strength, because I was on a rope, and it wasn't easy for sure. And there were days that you could feel that pain physically, where you just hurt, and especially when you were with your kids and they were trying to work through it with you. Yeah, it's a hard journey, for sure.
What was the journey like for Jody, who, by the way, was a fiery Italian?
She was a fiery Italian. She was a fighter, and the journey for her, I think, was, at first it was kind of, I'm going to beat this because I'm who I am. And then when it started to settle in that it was terminal, and she knew it was terminal for about a year, she really handled it with a tremendous amount of grace. She was sure of her salvation. She was sure of the fact that eternal life waited for her in heaven. Her family was not made up of believers, and so she spent time ministering to her family. Her mother would spend a lot of time at our home and watch Jody live this out in front of them. I mean, there were moments of fear. There were moments of sadness. I think for a mother of that age, the hardest thing is to leave your kids. She probably was glad to leave me, but leaving your children is a whole other story. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was the hardest thing for her. And she made very sure that before she died, she made videos for them. She wrote letters to them that they would open up, and all the key dates of their life, their weddings, their graduations, and so Wendy their stepmom has been really great to honor that and make sure that they see all these things that Jody did for them.
Yeah. I want to quote you from the book here, Paul. You said trauma can be brutal. It scars, it has physical effects, it isolates, it strips away the best part of our personality, it creates anxiety and fear, and we feel trapped. That's not a very encouraging statement right there, but it's true, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. My personality is not what it was before all of these things started to happen. I'm a different person now. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think God molds you into a different person. One of my friends said that you're going to be a little sadder and a little wiser. And I think what happens is it just takes something out of you that, I don't know if you want to call it a spark. I don't know if you want to call it a willingness to be reckless and fun. But whatever it is, your personality does change because it's tiring. It is, as you go through the experience, you do come out the other side, but you lose something of that energy and your emotional, wherewithal in the middle of that. And I think that's the other thing that's so hard is because your friends want you to be the other person that you were before, but you can't be because you're not that person. Yeah. And so the people that would know me now here in Minnesota would maybe not even recognize that person before Jody got sick.
Yeah. Talking with our regular host, Paul Johnson, who's our guest today, sharing his story about the loss of his wife, Jody, and then we'll be talking about the loss of his son, Taylor, as well. The grieving process, Paul, let's talk about that a little bit, and then I want to get you into some more positive things about meeting your current wife, Wendy, but talk about the grieving process and how we probably are not real good about watching people grieve. We want them to stop grieving and get on with their lives, but just what was your experience with grieving?
Yeah, I think that I not only felt that from others, I think I put that pressure on myself too, because I had to raise my kids. And so I'm not really honestly even sure I dealt with this very well at first. I think the advantage of having, if there is an advantage to having someone be sick for a long time, is you grieve in the process of them being sick. So you do a lot of that work kind of before they pass away, and that leads others to look at you and say, like, well, why aren't you sadder? Why aren't you this or that? There's a lot of judgment that goes along with this from others. I found my situation to be one of like I just had to park my own emotions to get my kids through it. I just didn't have any choice. Mm-hmm. They needed to be in school. They needed to have their normal lives. They were grieving. Our youngest son kept running away. And that'll keep you up at night. And so I probably didn't deal with it for 5 or 10 years. Really deal with it. But it's a process that never stops either. It keeps going. And so when you think you're over it, then something will happen where maybe you'll have a regret. Maybe you'll look back and there's a memory that is really sweet, but it's still kind of raw and you don't even see it coming. And that's what people are going through that have lost people. And one thing I've learned is that it doesn't matter if you've lost a mother who's 95 or a son who's 20 or, whatever the situation is. Sometimes we say, oh, they had a long life and, it hurts. People are grieving and they're maybe embarrassed to say they're grieving their 95-year-old mother, but they are. Yeah.
And you still grieve when you see how it affects your kids to this day, 20 years later, right? Yeah,
100%. And that's where you kind of talk to God and say, why these kids? And the why question will not get you anywhere because it really is a matter of faith, of believing in God's promises and that God is sovereign and he knows best. But it does hurt to see because they don't even realize the gap that's there, but I can see it.
Yeah.
And there's nothing I can really do except for pray for them.
Yeah. Well, and then God led you to another wonderful lady named Wendy. Talk about that process.
Yeah, that was kind of surprising, actually, because I wasn't on the lookout for a woman to marry at that point. In fact, as God would have it, I was a singles pastor as part of my responsibility. So there were women that were kind of going, wow, the singles pastor doesn't have, he's single now. So I was kind of running away from that a little bit. But it so happened that somebody knew something, and Wendy had worked on the staff with me at the church, but I didn't really know her at all because, again, it was a big church. And we met, and she lived in the Pacific Northwest. I lived in Arizona. We did a long-distance dating relationship, which was very expensive. I don't recommend that. But it was one of those things where I think Wendy would say that she felt called to step in and shepherd our family. She had also been through some heartache. Her husband had abandoned her for another woman, so she was raising a very young child herself. And so we had some commonalities there. But yeah, God obviously put that together. It didn't make the pain go away by any stretch of the imagination, but that was obviously his plan all along. And I married into a wonderful family of really great Christian people, and that was certainly a gift from God.
Yeah. And your stepdaughter, Wendy's daughter, Mackenzie, was maybe two
or three, yeah, right in there.
She was really young when
Yep.
you guys met.
Yep.
But just watching that relationship and how God can restore the brokenness in this world. And I want to read a couple of verses that you actually put in this devotional. God is always with you, 31 days of hope and healing for grief and loss. By the way, Paul Johnson, our normal host, is our guest today, talking about losses in his life. But Hebrews 4:15 and 16 says, For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So he's been through all of this. I mean, loss is horrific. Your losses have been horrific. God lost a son.
Yeah.
He understands.
Willingly.
Yeah.
And so I take a lot of solace in the fact that I can sit and before God and basically tell him everything and tell him anything. I'm not afraid to expose my heart to God, as much as we can as human beings. Obviously, there's things floating around there that I haven't identified yet that are going to be, repented of someday. But I take great hope in the fact that I can talk to a God who knew all of this before he went to the cross. He died to redeem these situations and these people. He feels the pain. He knows the pain. Jesus went through every kind of suffering imaginable, physical abuse, sexual abuse. He was naked on the cross. He was spit on. He would say, yeah, Paul, I get it. I know. And I think that's a wonderful gift we have as believers. We don't have a God who's far off, who is distant, that we have to find. If we're Christ followers, Jesus lives right inside of us, and so we don't have to go anywhere to find him. He's right there.
Yeah. We have about 90 seconds, so I want you to put on your pastor's hat now and talk to the person who's just suffered a tremendous loss of a spouse or a child. And what would you, if you were counseling them right now, what would you say to them?
First, I would say don't give up. There's going to be dark days ahead. You may be experiencing incredible darkness and loneliness right now, but don't give up. Realize that God is there with you all of the time. I'm not going to say you should do anything, but if you have the wherewithal, try to read some scripture. Try to reach out to a friend. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But here's what I would say is I will always be here for you. You can always call me. You can always come and talk to me. And honestly, for a pastor, that's why you're a pastor. Mm-hmm. Most pastors love making that offer because that's why we got into this in the first place.
Yeah. You have done really well sitting in the guest chair. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
It's really uncomfortable.
I'll expect the payment to be in the mail soon.
It's really uncomfortable. I know that. But next time we're going to talk about the loss of your son Taylor to a homicide and all the things that have happened in your life since then, and how difficult that road has been. And then I want to talk from a pastoral standpoint too. How, I want you to speak to pastors on how much transparency do they offer their congregation, which is, I know, a struggle for you to kind of figure that out sometimes. So Paul Johnson, our normal host, has been our guest. I'm Steve Johnson, normally just a co-producer of this program, but I happen to be the brother of Paul. Thank you for listening to Life Support, and join us next time.